Excellent. Thank you all for staying. Third panel today is about digital health and innovation in digital health. We've already heard a lot about digital health. And so clearly it's a fashionable area, if nothing else, and one I think that there's obviously lots going on in. It's an area that promises, or has been promising, huge amounts. It's promising that shift from sick care to healthcare that David Pryor talked about. It's promising the shift from fee for service to value-based healthcare. It's promising to be the linchpin of precision medicine, and it's promising to be the disruptor of healthcare. Whether it is yet or not, I will let you decide. Like all early innovation areas, its metrics at this stage seem to be more about how much money it's raised than anything else. This year having raised, certainly in the US, I think about $30 billion, which just for scale-wise is about the same scale as has gone into biopharma in that period. So as a segment of investment and future belief by investors in innovation, it's of that scale, and therefore is important, and it's important to all of us that it therefore comes good and works right, but it has its challenges. We've already heard about the challenges of digital inequity. We know the challenges of engagement. We know the challenges of that the regulation hasn't been worked out, or the reimbursement, although people like Sam are working very hard on that. It's also an area that's still young enough that there is a plethora of business models, many of which will fail, and hopefully some will work. Anyway, we have a great panel this evening, this afternoon, and hopefully they'll be able to shed some light on it. But as we've seen earlier, there's lots of questions, and lots of questions earlier were about digital, so I'm expecting questions from everyone, unless you've all dried up. So I'll introduce the panel. My name's Andy Richards. You can read the biog. I'm involved in digital health and have been an innovator in healthcare in the UK. I'm passionate about it for a long time. From left to right, Dan Mahony. Dan has been a visionary in this space in many ways. He's been talking about it at conferences for as long as I can remember, and he is unusual in being one of the few specialist, having been one of the few specialist public market healthcare investors in the UK. With Pollard Capital, having been an analyst before that, and now he has a role where he's getting more engaged, sleeves rolled up, with innovative companies, including being a venture partner at Evotec, and on the board of a number of other, mainly digital health companies. To Dan's right is Catherine Pollard. Catherine is Director of Technology Policy at NHS England and the Department of Health and Social Security, so sits that pivotal role and will tell us more about where that fits within the health system. She has a glittering career, both operationally, strategically and policy-wise, within various bodies within the NHS. To her right is Vishal Gulati. Vishal describes himself as a deep tech investor. But Vishal is one of the active investors in both early stage and scale up in digital health and in technology applied to healthcare and in data, and has done much of the thinking, certainly for mentoring many early stage startups, and invests his own money as an angel. And to his right is Andy Blackwell. Andy Blackwell is a cognitive neuroscientist and a psychologist, and actually has set up was one of the founders of one of the very first digital healthcare companies, probably before digital health was probably deemed a thing, Cambridge Cognition, which came out of Cambridge University, and now is really the founding intellect behind Ieso Digital Health, which is a mental health digital health company. So that's your panel. We're going to talk a little bit. We're not going to talk about what's been talked about to date. So we've heard a lot about digital in clinical trials, heard a lot about digital within innovation in pharma, and all of those are incredibly areas that lots is happening and lots going on, and there's lots of impact. But we're going to talk now about where digital health is actually impacting on patients now, and hopefully some specific examples. But this whole flood of activity and interest in the space, to start with, why is it happening and why now? And Dan, do you want to just give us some thoughts on that?
So, thanks, Andy. So I think digital health is quite a broad church. Yeah. And it covers many different things. But I think the underlying driver for companies and investors is the need we have to improve efficiency in healthcare systems. And I think what's getting people really excited at the moment, probably three different things. The first that we've heard a little bit about today is data and data analytics, AI, whatever you want to wrap up in that. I think that's partly because we can get better predictive tools of populations of patients, as well as of individual patients. And also it enables us, we've been very good at measuring the cost of a therapeutic intervention. We now maybe actually be able to measure the value of a therapeutic intervention. And I think that is a bit of a change. The other one that's been accelerated by COVID is this idea that the front door of healthcare has been blown off its hinges by telehealth. And what that's created is a new channel to get to the patient. So instead of needing a face-to-face consultation with a GP or some medical professional, there's now another way of getting to the patient. And so that enables different ways of selling products and services. And I think the final thing that's probably the most important is consumer expectations are changing. So if you think of the Amazon generation, well, I suppose we're all the Amazon generation, but sort of you expect stuff to be on demand when it suits you, and I think that's really important. The other thing is that most people, most consumers think healthcare is complicated. They probably don't even know what a care pathway is, nor should they, and they want things to be simple. And so if you can try and simplify that with digital tools, whatever it may be, then I think that there's a big opportunity for actually beginning to change care pathways and change the way that care can be delivered. And the final thing, which is not so much in this country, but there's a real sense of how do you make healthcare affordable. And that's definitely true in the United States. It's true in many other parts of the world. And I think all those things together are changing at the moment, and that's what's creating the opportunity as technology comes along and starts to disrupt healthcare.
Thanks, Dan. So, Vishal, we're seeing, as I said earlier, that much of this, and in fact in every innovation area, a lot of it's driven by investors and corporates and people who are looking for the future. So how are investors looking at this, and particularly investors looking at what works both as an investment from a business model perspective, but also from a where is there going to be impact on patients?
Thank you, Andy. Yes, I think let me try and paint a picture just like Dan did, and I'd like to sort of zoom out one step beyond that. So healthcare systems have been driven by scarcity until now. So this is a world of scarcity we have always lived in. There has never been enough healthcare for everyone who needs healthcare, no matter how rich a country is, no matter how poor a country is. And there is now an opportunity to move from this world of scarcity to a world of abundance, as has happened in other industries. So if you look at the biggest disruptions that have happened in industries, they are industries that have gone through this inflection point of world of scarcity to world of abundance. Blockbuster was a world of scarcity. You had a certain number of films that you could take out. And Netflix is a world of abundance where there is no limit to what you can watch. I still can't find anything to watch, but that's a different story. But so what we have seen now in the last few years is how we are increasing the efficiency of the world of scarcity. So if you think about telemedicine, what it has tried to do is to bridge the gap between demand and supply, but what it cannot do is create more supply of physicians like what Ieso has done. It has matched the patient with a therapist, but until now, what we have done is we have created more demand for therapists, and our ability to create more therapists, more radiologists, more primary care physicians is still capped. So I believe that the next generation of digital health is going to be when we move from this highly efficient world of scarcity to a more efficient world of abundance. So that's where the new opportunities are. So I think These opportunities of optimizing the world of scarcity are already done. Telemedicine is done. It has gone to its peak. It's now sort of settled down a bit. Companies that were worth $4 billion 3 months ago are worth $500 million now. So that's kind of how that is coming about. Where we are now going, which is what is the exciting phase now for investors and hopefully for corporates, is when we break through that barrier, where we are able to support the demand of healthcare that has been generated by more digitized tools which are smarter and have more cognition built inside them. To give you an example, and I'm not going to give example of just my portfolio companies, the company I would like to mention is Viz.ai, which has integrated the diagnosis of stroke, and it is FDA approved, where you can have centers which do not have interventional neurology to be able to get data rapidly from patients. There is a preliminary diagnosis made by an AI, which is FDA approved, and then the patient can be monitored more optimally. You have a company like Caption, which has an FDA approved algorithm, which is able to scan someone's heart and get images from for an echocardiogram without any training. It's like Google Maps for ultrasound, if you like. So someone who's a school leaver can be trained within half an hour to collect images of the heart, which are good enough for a cardiologist to report on. Then you have a company like Ultromics in Oxford, which can take those images and make a diagnosis of strain, which is also FDA approved. So if you think about that, we have now moved from the first generation to the second generation, which is what I find really exciting.
And in terms of the investor base, that's you. How would you describe the heterogeneity or the sophistication of the investor base that's putting this in the US $29 billion?
So I think that I would say that there are two types of investors. Some investors go in early stages where they are taking the risk of whether this product will actually work or not. And that's sort of where I take most of my risk. I invest in these companies before they have an FDA approval and hope for the FDA approval to come through. And most importantly, in digital, more important or equally important to an FDA approval is a reimbursement code. So once that package is done, at that point, the next group of investors are happy to pile in a lot more money because now they can look at the economics of this business. So when we are looking at it, we kind of have an expectation of what economics would be, but what we are really looking for is a step change in technology. So those are the two groups of investors. Once it gets a reimbursement code, once you start getting your revenue in, then there's a lot more investors who will then pile in with huge amounts of money. Coming back to corporates for your first question, what corporates are now looking for is how does that fit in their existing business models. I have not seen a corporate wanting to do ultrasound diagnosis yet. So, I'm not looking at, but I can imagine Novartis, which has a heart failure drug, want to have some kind of relationship with this company that can identify cases of heart failure early. So those are the kind of things that are becoming more interesting.
And the corporates, in this case, are not just pharma.
No, not just pharma, but I do believe that medical device companies have not been very forthcoming in their move towards digital. I think that...
And the tech world?
Tech world has been, to be fair, has been disappointing. All big tech companies made a play for digital health. Google did that, Amazon did that, Facebook did that. But I think that they got mired in their own problems to the point that I don't think they anticipated how hard it will be. And healthcare is hard, we all know that.
Okay. So Catherine, from a health systems perspective, particularly the big health system, how do you see digital health, or how's it being seen?
Yeah, so I think that Dan and Vishal and a lot of the speakers earlier have kind of set out the great opportunities that digital health offers. If I think about the three big challenges that we face, we have a prevention challenge that David spoke about, we have a personalization challenge, and we have the workforce, the people challenge. And there is significant roles for digital to play in addressing all of those. But And I think you've seen that response during COVID. I mean, we have, across the Western world, really seen a much more rapid uptake in digital channels and digital technologies across the board. And the FDA have been very progressive, as have particularly the Germans in terms of their DIGA regulations, all of which we're keeping a keen eye on. But what we're doing in the NHS in England is kind of also facing into the fact that we're starting from quite a low base. We have really mixed levels of digital maturity. So 20% of hospitals in this country still work on a kind of paper basis. So we are funneling billions of pounds into making sure that every trust has an electronic health record by the end of the next 2 years. We're doing the same in care to make sure that care homes and home care providers have also got really basic digital tools. We're making sure that there's, again, big investment into data platforms to harness and bring together all of that data to make it available for the NHS, but also so that it can be shared appropriately with innovators, be it just support a clinical trial or to support new AI training or new evidencing. And we're also doing quite a lot on the kind of regulation side, working with NICE and the MHRA to think through what's a national pathway to reimbursement. And indeed, how do we create the right oversight framework for the NHS? It's a very performance managed system, so that they know that digital is important. So at the moment we have the CQC and we have the financial regulations. At the moment, digital features nowhere in any of those. The plan is to change that very soon. But that's kind of, so there's kind of a recognition of that low basis. We're starting from here, but we have both Amanda and the Secretary of State's full support for putting digital very much at the forefront of how they see the reform to the health and care system going forward. The other role, I mean, certainly that I think we have, and we spoke about it earlier in terms of digital inclusion. Martin spoke about digital apartheid. We talk about digital inclusion and digital exclusion, and really making sure that we understand what that means in reality, and how we can build consumer confidence, both from a data sharing perspective and in this is a legitimate way to access the NHS services. The NHS app is a fantastic platform that we can use to do a lot of that. It's now in the hands of 60% of the adult population in England, of which 40% still use it every month, even though COVID Pass is no longer required. We have millions and millions of repeat prescriptions ordered every month. So I think many people still think of the NHS as a very analog service. Compared to some industries, but we are very much getting with that particular program.
And you say compared to other industries. How do you think we compare, therefore, with other countries? Do you monitor that?
Yeah, we keep a relatively close eye. I mean, I think the parts of the US health system have been much more progressive than we have. They have deeper pockets, and because they're not operating in a single payer system, the likes of the big healthcare providers, like, in Boston and Intermountain and Kaiser and so on, they can decide autonomously that they want to roll out digital health products for their population. And you'll face this exhaustive process you have to go to in order to be approved and then commissioned.
If it is any consolation, getting a product through Kaiser is very, very hard.
Thank you.
And it takes a long time.
So I think we are, I would say we're ahead of a number of European countries.
Can I make a caveat to that? So yes, I think that in terms of, so we are making a huge push for adoption now, yeah. But I think that we still do not look at digital products as a reimbursed product. Yeah. I think that is a mindset issue which needs to be addressed at some point. And we do not give it the same level of, because it's very different, and I think Douglas Adams said that any technology that is invented after you're 35 is an abomination, so it is a new thing, yeah. And because it is a new thing, it is not, we are trying to fit it either in the old thing here or old thing there. We are just not looking at it based on what its properties are, because the value chain of a digital product is very different. So if you think of a primary care physician who will prescribe metformin, It's a very different thing than if they were to prescribe an app, for example. And we are not making pathways, we are not making the rails on which these products can sit. And I think the challenge is the rails. We are trying to invent for each product every time, and I think
that still goes back to your land of your scarcity versus plenty.
Yes.
The rails are different in a land of scarcity than a land of plenty.
So I think Vishal has done an absolutely fair reflection of the status quo, but we are working with NICE and we'll be piloting this summer a number of mental health and cardiovascular products, an early access scheme with NICE to look at what a national route for national commissioning and national procurement is.
I think that is absolutely the right thing to do. The thing, DIGA in Germany has its problems, but there is a path that people can focus on. And I've seen companies in the UK saying, actually, we're not doing NHS anymore. We are going to launch our product in Germany. And I don't think it should be competitive. But what I'm saying is that giving innovators a certainty, like NICE has given for drugs, pharmaceutical companies have a certainty. They hated the process when it first started. They all lobbied against it. But then they ultimately came around saying, we have to live with this. And now what they do is when they're doing a clinical trial, they think about what might NICE say 10 years down the road, and they think about that question. And I want digital innovators to be thinking about you when they are making this product, saying, whatever the equivalent is, what should I invent that should fit in those rails?
But as an investor,
yes.
And we'll come back just on that point. So Sam talked about it earlier about how much she's focusing. That's Sam and you that are dealing on that. So you're doing that. But just as an investor, do you invest in anything where the UK looks like the market?
Ideally not. So I think that is an unfair question. This is not. As a former NHS employee, I think that's an unfair question. Yeah. But I do believe but it is true for. So the way I'm going to duck out of this question is going to be as follows, which is that I think that all VC-funded companies should have much bigger market than UK alone. Yeah. So we have to build things that have global markets, and which is why UK alone or Germany alone or France alone doesn't quite cut it. US alone might.
Yeah,
sorry.
You wanted.
Well, I just had to come at it from the perspective of how to be a good customer. And if you're going to be a good customer, then you need evidence.
Yes.
And so the FDA examples you talked about were, if you like, traditional medicine. It's how do you test the diagnostic, and that's regulated. But there's all sorts of apps that aren't treated in that way, the ones that provide the logistic capabilities, where at the moment there isn't a clear requirement for evidence, and there needs to be. And the Amazon metaphor was used before, and people think they know what they're buying with Amazon. They quite often get saddled with fakes, but broadly and there is a whole health app consumer market being developed where people will buy snake oil. And they won't realize they're being conned, and actually there's the danger that they'll be killed or won't get the treatments that will make them better. And so I think it does go to your point, which is really important, that if the markets are to develop, actually NICE-like bodies are essential.
Absolutely.
Because that's the only way that the NHS can know whether to be a customer or not. Oh. And I speak for having looked through with the jury a number of the digital products for this. And the question always is, how good is the evidence that this actually provides benefit?
And it's not just the product. I mean, the thing about an early industry like this is the business models are very, very different. And actually, that's probably a good thing. I mean, I would sort of suggest that one of the challenges that pharma has is that the business models are too homogeneous. I mean, EQT coming in is an interesting example. How exciting is that? Someone coming in with a different business model. But in digital health, we're still in that world, which the tech world is in, of multiple business models, many of which will fail, many of which are move fast and break things. And in health, move fast and break things is dangerous. And so I think you're right that some of these things will harm unless we think about evidence and we think about regulation the right way.
And sorry, I'll shut up after this, but I think there's another really difficult issue for the customer, which is everyone now is developing an AI algorithm for some tiny bit of medicine, be it a kidney biopsy or looking at a skin rash or looking at the retina, loads of them. this is going to increase the price of healthcare. It's not going to decrease it. There's a sort of anarchic market with everyone developing their own sort of piffling product.
But I think one other thing that digital also does, sorry to take, sorry we've left Andy to the side, is that one of the characteristics of digital products is that it does not create too many players. It ultimately has a winner-take-all type nature to it. Yeah. And we've already seen that algorithms that people develop, early algorithms, are probably useless. They're much better than not having anything, but the real good algorithms that you see, they have to pay attention to things like generalizability. They have to pay attention to other things. And I do believe that there is currently a gap among health professionals on how to evaluate digital products. Because we have a training system, which I went through. We learn a lot about how to evaluate drugs, not so much vaccines, which we're kind of filling the gaps now. But for digital, it's very, very hard for a lot of academics to engage with it or want to engage with it or to be able to rapidly evaluate. But I'll shut up now.
Dan.
So to your point, I think competition's a good thing. Just generally economically, it reduces the price to consumers and usually improves the quality. So I think having too many things isn't necessarily a bad thing because the wheat will get sorted from the chaff. I think the other thing as well, when you talk about customer, I think one of the biggest challenges in healthcare, it has one of the most complicated value chains of any industry because the person or entity paying for the healthcare is not the person who's choosing it, which is often the doctor, and is not the person receiving the benefit from it. And so when you ask for evidence, it depends sort of evidence of what and for whom, because it could be that sort of if I use a running app because I want to make sure that I do my 10 kilometers every day, the level of evidence doesn't, if it's 9.8, 10.2, doesn't really matter. And so it's sort of what outcome are you wanting to prove, as it were, and what is the consequence, or what decision do you want to be made to do for that? And I think as you go further into medicine, to sort of, obviously, I think the height of the evidence gets greater for obvious reasons. But I think the beauty of digital is that it is one way of getting to the mass market, because virtually everybody's got a mobile phone. And it's sort of, I think you'll end up with different types of products and services that serve at different segments of the market, some of which will be cheap and some will be quite expensive.
Andy, I'm going to come to you, otherwise it's not very fair.
I'm enjoying listening to you.
So within that world, and certainly that world from the investment viewpoint, mental health has been one of the areas that I think lots of people believe that the digital probably has an early major role to play, and certainly has been having a role to play, and an area where there's been a lot of investment and there have been business models, some of which have been changing. Do you just want to talk a bit about where you think the impact is currently and where it's moving to?
I think there's really two phases, perhaps, of impact now that I can see. So everybody knows it's Mental Health Awareness Week. Everybody's probably a lot more aware now after the pandemic than they were before about mental health related issues. Every family on earth goes affected by these problems. So access is really the place where it has had an impact already, and so I think and that needs to continue. There are some. One statistic is that there are in half the countries on earth there are fewer than 4 trained mental health professionals per 100,000 people in the population. So there is a need to find new ways of reaching people. And demonstrably here in the UK, we have, I think, the world-leading primary care mental health system, which is called IAPT, or Improving Access to Psychological Therapies. And layered within that, there are a range of digital options, both software-based support services for low acuity conditions and mental telecare, so telecare solutions. And in the numbers, demonstrably, access to psychological therapies has incrementally and significantly improved over the last decade. And I think technology has played a significant part in that. Access also, by the way, is not just about trying to load balance supply and demand or simply reach more and more people with the same thing, but many of the conditions that we treat, mood and anxiety disorders, are by their nature impediments to seeking help. So if you have an anxiety disorder, you're avoidant of reaching out and accessing those things that might enable you to live a flourishing life. So I think, and people often don't want to drive across town and sit in a porter cabin and for an hour and then drive back home again. So I think we've seen a dramatic effect through telecare and software-based mental health support services that are evidenced in terms of improving access. I think the really exciting thing that I think is beginning here again. The UK, I think, can be very proud of itself in that it has imposed an outcomes measurement framework. So everybody that receives talking therapies in primary care in the UK has to have their outcome recorded, and that has to be reported transparently on a case record level basis to the NHS and to the people that are commissioning care locally. And that in itself, the act of measurement, has driven improvements in outcomes on a cohort basis. We've seen also that, so we have about 6,000 people in treatment every day. We're available to about 20 million people, and it's impossible to quality control care on that scale without the application of algorithms. And so we've applied machine learning, natural language processing technology just to check that people, when they're receiving therapy, are in fact receiving therapy, as opposed to receiving chit-chat. And more often than you would like, that is in fact the case. And so we found, and again, we've been trying to be responsible. We've published in JAMA Psychiatry and The Lancet and other places to show that you can in fact identify those things that really matter in a treatment course in order to drive the alleviation of symptoms. So digital health is definitely playing a role in improving access, but I think it's increasingly going to play a role in increasing access to something that is more reliable in delivering an outcome, delivering you from illness to wellness. And I think that the thing that we're also starting to realize is that it's not just about alleviating, in our space, mood and anxiety symptoms, but it's actually using psychology to address the behavior modifiable elements of all chronic disease. So helping people to engage and activate with their illness, and diabetes, for example, is a case in point, helping people to step towards the care and play a more active role in the management or in prevention of severe or chronic illness. So I think access and quality, and probably, I hope, in the future, it can play a role in the prevention of incident, or at least secondary prevention of episodes of mental illness.
Does the economic benefit and drivers fit with that model?
I think one of the radically innovative things, when we, like all UK digital health businesses, we are now moving to America and exporting the same model, which is being welcomed by the payers, the health plans in the US. And part of the appeal of that is that most of the organizations that we serve commission us on a fee-for-value payment framework. So we get paid a bit for assessing and engaging with the patient, and then we get paid when we get people well. So it's like a bonus at the end of which is related principally to clinical outcome measured objectively using scales as you would use in a randomized control trial. That has allowed the organization that I'm most familiar with to invest in science. We have a lab with 30 PhD mental health scientists working to understand the drivers of outcome. So I think, yes, it absolutely matters. It's also something that is, believe it or not, the NHS is seen, when I'm talking to payers in the US, as the sort of global exemplar of primary care mental health. And that's not an Ieso thing, that's a David Clark IAPT, primary care mental health systemic thing.
So it's interesting about, if you compare the US or China for entrepreneurs to the UK, typically the most successful digital companies, they built something and discovered by accident that it's to your point about channels, then it's a fantastic draw. And then suddenly lots of big money will come in from VC. And in the UK, you often find you'll start a company, you've got a really good idea, but you don't have anything like as much capital, and you're behind them. And Vishal's normally very generous at pointing out which those companies are. But it's in terms of what we need to do, in the UK, are the investors here too smart? You've done biotech, you've understood biology, you've understood what sounds like a really good idea, but in the US, it's more exploratory and discovery-based.
So, so first of all, I don't think that it is good to have local capital, and it's good to have local capital early. What is catastrophic for an innovation system is to not have early capital, which is local. But later stage capital matters less. Because once you are a big enough company and you are in many countries, then investors from other countries will also invest in you. So if you think about the biggest venture capital firms in the world, if you're looking at Sequoia, if you're looking at Lightspeed, they all in the last 12 months have opened offices in London. Many of them have been investing in Europe for many, many years. So I think that I do believe that there is a lot of capital, early capital in the UK for early stage companies. What is challenging for a lot of companies is to attract foreign capital if the only market that they are accessing is the UK or somewhere in Europe, because those markets tend to pay less per unit patient or whatever unit you might want to use. So what is almost essential for a UK digital health company, if they want to be funded to the levels that are globally relevant, is to have a product somewhere in the US or in another market which gives them the value that will help build a case for a massive outcome. So this is what has happened to some of the companies in my portfolio. There's a company I invested in called Quit Genius, and I'm mentioned it, I want to put it forward that I am an investor, but it's a good example of a company that started here in the UK. They did their first randomized controlled trial in the UK. It cost them all of £280,000. They did it in primary care for smoking cessation, using CBT on an app to help people give up smoking. And then they started to knock on the doors with various commissioners to want to commission that. They got 1 or 2 small contracts. But then they were lucky enough the team was relatively young. They were willing to move over and go and spend a lot of time in the US. They knocked on the doors of payers who were a specific type of payer, which is in the US, if you are a self-insured employer, if you're an employer with a few thousand patients, you insure them yourself on your own balance sheet. So there you have as close to you get as a single payer system that the whole economic model is kind of in one room. There are 2 people in that room who are responsible for the outcomes of the people in their population. And they managed to sign up trucking companies which had lots and lots of employees who were smoking. And the more people that got off smoking, their insurance budgets went lower and lower because of the risks of other diseases associated with smoking. And now they have more or less, so they have 100 employees in the US, they still have 40 employees in the UK. They no longer have any contracts in the UK because the contracts in the US are much more lucrative, and they're attracting capital from venture capitalists around the world. So that's an example of what could be the natural history of a startup which got funded locally.
But that also fits David Pryor's worry from the last session. But Catherine, you wanted to...
Yeah, I was going to say that this issue came up a lot when we were doing a life sciences vision last summer. And the thing that I heard from investors is what there is not is any kind of level of certainty, either about what evidence standards we're going to hold digital health products to, what the regulatory pathway is, and more importantly, how to avoid having to go and sell their wares to 211 CCGs who are probably distracted by being restructured for like the 3rd time in 5 years. And so we're effectively trying to say, well, actually, we can do scale purchasing. I mean, we purchase on behalf of 50 million people. It's a pretty big customer base, but we need the right level of evidence. Like that, if you want to be able to access that market in one go, that is for the gold standard of products that have the best cost-effective and the best clinical effective
we do that for drugs.
evidence. Exactly.
But that was Sam's statement earlier about national commissioning,
And that's what
rather than what you talked about about with Quit Genius was this CCG by CCG,
Correct.
Yeah, and so
which has always been a problem.
Yeah, and we're trying to eradicate that. And we're, as I said, we're starting to move into that space with digital health and with AI products. But I still, like, it is going to be a kind of, and we have examples with Grail, for example, where we have things that even we think are promising and we'll support them through trials. And then we will say, okay, that looks successful, but we'll purchase it. And one of the things, we will never be the highest per unit payer in the world. We are very proud of the fact we have the biggest Microsoft discount in the world, but we will hope, because it's taxpayers' money, right?
Yes.
You guys have got to remember that. But we do want to start to give that certainty, but we want to hold it to that high level of evidence.
But should it not be the goal of the National Health Service, with your leadership in it, that we are currently net exporter of innovation?
Yeah.
We have companies that are going away from the UK. We want to become net importers of innovation. And we want to be able to set a standard where companies like Quit Genius that are starting in America are thinking about coming to the UK, because there is a simple, straightforward, there are rails in place and there is certainty, and their venture capitalists saying, go to the UK, and if you can convince them, then we will give you more money.
But,
But just going back to the original question, I think people talk about no scale-up capital in this country. What's interesting is there have been 3 digital health companies listed on the London Stock Exchange that have been spin-outs of Mount Sinai in New York. One's Renalytics AI, one's Verici DX, both in kidney, and the other is Trellis Health, which I'm on the board of. And so the idea that public investors don't get it, because when they listed, none of them had revenue. And some of them might have revenue for a while. So I think there is investor appetite for some of these types of companies. And I think it's partly, you could comment, I think the venture community in this country is less willing to invest in these things than the public markets, actually, which is a bit strange because that's not sort of the perceived wisdom. And I think each of those companies would love to be launching into the NHS if there was a clear pathway or direction to go, because they've got a bunch of UK invest. It's the opposite of the NASDAQ problem. They're American companies listed here. It's bonkers. And so I think that sort of creating those pathways, I think, would be really important. And it could draw more of those companies here, which means you get investors who understand it better, which then creates the virtuous circle.
But people have to see the value of doing something. That's the investor point, but people have to see the value of what you get here. Andy's example of the fact that we have an outcomes measurement framework in mental health, that is pretty much the only one, the gold standard globally, isn't it?
It is, and I think it affords auditability and all of those hygienic factor things for primary care mental health, but it also is a data asset that essentially is describing decisions that are made by clinicians, the actions that they take, and the consequent effects on health outcomes on a massive scale, on an unprecedented scale in mental health science, which is making the UK seen by key opinion leaders everywhere as the place to conduct mental health science, which I think is also important. But it also, for young companies, if you want to introduce your product into a health system and have a ready vehicle to collect real-world outcomes data and potentially build health economics models of the cost effectiveness of those interventions, this could be the world-leading place to do that. It's a bit disjointed currently in terms of access to those data, but we're a few small steps away from the UK being a standing trial environment for mental health discovery and implementation. I think it's super exciting.
There was a question
Hi, it's Simon Roslingham. I'm from Behold.ai. So I do disagree with you, Vishal, on the fact that you have to go to America. So I did teleradiology 16 years ago. My capital was 4 personal loans at 25 grand, 10 credit cards at 15,000. I remortgaged my house, and it's listed on the London stock market now. I didn't buy a house in the country. I bought a house just round the corner, so it's a really quite a second walk. And in terms of going to Mark's point, I'm now doing autonomous AI diagnosis. That is on a chest X-ray or CT scan. My dear radiologist next to me doesn't have to look at it. Now, if I was trying to do that in America, that would cost me hundreds of millions of pounds. It's cost me £4 million, and I have no private equity or venture capital. So the bar is higher, but the opportunity is enormous. So I would actually disagree with you quite fully that you have to actually prove to a higher bar and then jump to America, because America will take years to adopt autonomous AI diagnosis. And what do we have a shortage of? We have a shortage of radiologists. And I can add in 233, which take 10 years to train.
I
and
think it's
cost
a longer
£500,000.
conversation, but I don't think, I think that there are a lot of autonomous diagnostics already approved by the FDA and are being used every day.
But your point was to go over to America, where actually you can start here and do very well.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I think you should start here. And that is not what I said. What I did say was that it's very hard to, as an investor, to have certainty of markets. And certainty of markets is very important. It doesn't mean necessarily that I don't want people to start commissioning products that are not ready, but I want to know what they will do when it is ready. That is really important for me.
It's about the right question. So
yes.
I asked my clinicians, what AI should I build? Why doesn't anyone speak to the doctors about what
they all do?
And guess
Some
what?
of them are doctors.
And guess what? 40% of my investment is from doctors. So we're back. So
Quit Genius has 4 founders, all 4 are doctors.
So, but the point is, I think you sort of played down the UK opportunity quite significantly. And the work that's happening at NHSX and the data is absolutely a goldmine.
I think we are agreeing more than you think.
Okay.
So Catherine, I'm just going to bring you to something that was raised there, and maybe Andy might want to talk about this as well, which is the workforce challenge and the autonomous issue. So the augmentation and the augmentation versus autonomous, or the move from augmentation to increased how is that viewed at a sort of strategic level? Do you have a strategic view on that, or is it case by case?
I mean, so through the AI Lab, we've invested in approaching like 70 different products, some of which effectively provide clinical decision support, and some of which will start to push towards the autonomous range. I think our view is this is something kind of where we just need to kind of keep an eye and watch. I'm not sure that there is, I mean, there is some early promise about what is truly autonomous, and I think we need to, and the MHRA have, and I think June's still here somewhere, but have also like published a lot on kind of AI as a medical device, and it is tricky to get particularly the kind of more black box AI regulation right. And so I think this is an area where we want to be able to adopt things that are proven and efficacious, but we need to be able to explain to the public like what is, or to the clinical workforce that they're working with, like what the underlying logic of what this product is. So I think through the AI Lab, we're privileged to be able to be actually part of that evidence generation and some of the research that is going to be needed in order to push that on. But I think in the short term, we see clinical decision support as something, as a real area where we really, really want to push quite hard.
So, Andy, you're doing augmented, significantly AI augmented.
Yeah.
And you also have in the lab autonomous components. How do you see that move?
So practically, I can describe it. So you have therapy, and we're able to, every night, hundreds and hundreds of people, thousands of people are having therapy. In the morning after that, the supervisors who look after all of that therapist community can say, you have a clinical outcome rate of 80% for generalized anxiety disorder, but 25% for obsessive compulsive disorder, or you're in the X percentile for this. The reason we think that is the case is that for those people you use the wrong protocol, you don't say at homework, you're not using Socratic questions as you should for that protocol. And then you can give them directed guidance. And when we do that, we see the outcomes improve for those individuals in those. So it's a very practical thing. It's practically impossible to do that manually. So there's lots of talk of fancy-pantsy AI stuff, but actually it's just executing a massive task that cannot be done by humans and running a viable organization. So I think there's that class of AI application, which is sort of boring but hugely important. In terms of the automation of other tasks, like directly delivering elements of care, there are certain elements of it seems sort of counterintuitive for therapy, doesn't it? Because we think it's all sort of warmth and compassion and empathy, and which it is in part. But actually we know that the active ingredients of treatment are much more directive and structured than that. And there are certain elements of that we can deliver with what we call dialogue systems. So they're chat agents. Now, at the moment, they're used between sessions of therapy. So we're testing them under UK research ethics, where the therapist does an hour with the patient, and then between those sessions, they can continue to have a dialogue with these dialogue systems that might run a procedure with them, like a thought diary or cataloging your emotions and that sort of thing. So the idea is to like have a therapist with you continuously, so you're increasing the dose of exposure to treatment, which means our episode durations have come down, which means we can offer these things at lower cost. So it's simply not the case that you'll go from a therapist delivering care in our world to a fancy, sexy robot chat thing. That's just not going to happen. What's going to happen is it will happen in increments, and those increments will come with evidence, and we'll be measuring, of course, safety and the cost effectiveness implications, the health economic implications of that. So it's being implemented, but I think in a responsible, progressive way.
I think, Andy, you make a really important point. I think what happens inside a responsible AI company that is developing a medical product is very different from what people think happens in those companies.
Yeah. Dan, you wanted to?
Well, I suppose running out of
we've
time.
got 1 minute.
One last point, which I think's kind of important. So over 10 years, I had loads of tech people come in and tell me, healthcare's bust, I know how to fix it. And because apparently we're not smart enough to realise that. And I think that this idea that you have, everyone's searching for the Uber of healthcare. It's kind of like you want someone to just drive up in their car and start like doing a bit of heart surgery. I don't think so. So, and I think this idea that you've got some digital AI, all we need is the data. Give us the NHS data and we'll solve all the diseases. It's just not going to happen. And I think sort of one of the things what you talk about, so it's having vertical knowledge of your particular area is still really important. So there's loads of technologies around that are looking for an application. If you understand how yours works, yours might be fully autonomous, super duper. That may not apply in this specialty. Maybe you need augmentation here. In this specialty, you need something else. And I think that's a challenge for the system to understand that you're going to have different fits all over the place. But over time, there'll be some coherence that will emerge, and it begins to kind of make sense. And so I think in terms of what and when, I think it's coming pretty soon. And actually, in certain areas, be it mental health, it's already beginning to happen, or in radiology, it's already beginning to happen. And it's sort of, they're tunes that sort of, or poems that rhyme, but they're slightly different.
On that note, I think we've reached the end. So thank you all.
Thank you very much. That was a terrifically lively panel. In fact, we've had 3 lively panels, a very lively audience. And I just want to thank all of you, everyone who has spoken, who's put the sessions together. It was an experiment. I hope you'll agree it's a successful experiment to have a forum in association with the Galien Prize. And I look forward to seeing many of you at dinner in a little while. But it's a very exciting time for health and the health sciences. So terrific. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.